Paul says this in the entry to the entire chapter: eagerly desire spiritual gifts. Okay, but he says, and I want you to desire the gift of prophecy above all else. This is the word we're talking about, the pneumatikos, the spirit-animated things, these things that are beyond us. Now, here's the challenge. I think some of us would be like, yeah, like I'm there, like I want all these gifts all the time. And then a bunch of us, depending on like how you grew up or where you went to church or what you watched on Christian TV, would be like, no. Like, am I gonna have to grow big hair and get weird? And here's what Paul says, like, these gifts are meant to help us do the work of Jesus here on planet Earth. And some of us could just kind of say, like, I don't know. I've seen it abused or mistreated. In all of this, even where Paul's trying to correct their perspective on spiritual language, he still says, I want you all to do this. And he says, I don't want you just sit around and passively hope that one day you'll begin to experience the spiritual gifts. I want you to eagerly desire. I want you to be proactive. I want you to be pursuing the spiritual gifts. And some of us, that is just a terrifying thing, and I understand that. Paul says, if you want to do the work of Jesus Christ here on planet Earth, you're going to need these spiritual gifts. And you can't afford just to be passive and hope that one day they show up. Paul says, step out. How do you eagerly desire spiritual gifts? I first say, first of all, just pray. Especially if you find yourself resistant to this, just pray. I was talking to one of my really good friends after the last service. We're in a small group together, and he laughed. He grew up Catholic, and he grew up in northern Montana, and he says, while you were talking, I remembered this, that we'd drive by this lady's house when I was a kid, and my mom would go, hey, be careful of that lady. She speaks in tongues, right? She was like the scary lady on the street. Well, if that's my background, I'm going to need to pray. I'm going to say, God, would you make me open to things that I'm not necessarily in control of? I just want to pray for room and space. I want to ask that gifts would be operative in my life. So pray, create space. Pause, learn, explore, listen. And then the third one would just be step out. If you want to eagerly desire spiritual gifts, someday you're going to have to step out, and that's scary. And then the fourth one would be you just got to practice it. You got to practice it. Don't hurt anybody, but like it's any gift. Like through time and process, you can function in these better. So please, every one of us, no matter like how resistant you feel to this or what abuse you've seen, don't just dismiss spiritual gifts. Paul says, eagerly desire the spiritual gifts. Why? Because the world needs them. Remember this whole pneumatikos is meant to ease people's burdens. He says, I give you spiritual gifts because like the weight is too much for people. And I want to give somebody else to help them carry that. Eagerly desire spiritual gifts. Number 2, worship with your mind and beyond. Worship with your mind and beyond. So remember, Paul said this. So what am I going to do? He says, I'm going to pray with my spirit. And I'm going to pray with my mind. I am not going to do just one or the other. And I think most of us would be more comfortable with one or the other. Some of us, we're on that rational side. We want to pray with our mind. Like, just give me a good theology book. Let me study the Bible. Let me gain more knowledge. That is very important. Let me pray, but let me pray with really specific words. And then some of us would be like, yeah, I'm not really into the intellectual thing. Like, I just want to experience God, right? Give me a flowing dress and a tambourine. Let me dance a little bit. Right? Let me like get my emotions involved in it. Some of us are more inclined towards this. And Paul says, neither one is wrong or bad. He says, I just want you to pray in the spirit. I want you to understand that there is a world out there and your body doesn't completely understand it all. I want you to be engaged in that. And I also want you to be engaged in this. And here's the problem. Most churches in America today gravitate to one or the other. Like you come over to this church, and if you are not sweaty after worship, like you did not worship, right? It's got to be like, woo, woo, woo. But then, a bunch of churches in America are like this. Like, don't you dare smile, close your eyes, think about the song. This song was written 500 years ago. There's specific theology, engage with the theology, right? It's very, very intellectual. And Paul says, you know what a healthy disciple of Jesus does? They can be in both worlds. And they can worship and sing with their spirit, just beyond them. And they can just as well engage and think deeply and reflect and study the scriptures. So be in both. And here's what I would say, like, whichever one you are more comfortable with, stretch yourself in the other direction. Pray in both. And for a bunch of us who grew up in a very rational society, this is the side where you're like, step out. Learn to worship God. Learn to commune with your Creator beyond like the physical and the rational realm. Like, be engaged with Him, whichever way it is. Number three, remember Paul's vision for the church. Okay, through everything that Paul says, and he says it again in chapter 14, he says, when you come together, I want you to bring something. Not just a spiritual language. This is not the epitome of spirituality. I want you to come with a hymn, a word of encouragement. I want you to come with some sort of gift for the people in the room. And again, Paul continues to come back to this. I'm astounded at how much the Corinthians end up like the church in North America, that they were a little bit consumeristic. Like, I come to church for me. I come to church and I'm going to like yell out in my prayer language and try to impress everybody with how extensive my vocabulary is. Paul says, when you come to church, you have to remember that you don't go to church, you are the church, that the church is collaborative by nature, that I do not come to church just as a receiver, I come as a distributor. Okay, so when the church is really, really functioning well, is you receive things, but then you give things. That when you come to your small group, or you're in the office, or you're at school, or you're in a church setting like this, that I come into the room and I'm not just expecting to receive, I'm expecting that God is going to do something through me to lighten the load for someone else. Church is not an observer sport. Christianity is not a spectator sport. It is engagement. That is why the Spirit of God is there, so that He can work through you to do His work in someone else. Remember Paul's vision of the church. Here's the fourth and final thing. Offer God your voice. Offer God your voice. Next week we'll talk a little bit more about the power of words, but I just want you to think for a moment about some of the most hurtful words that have ever been spoken to you. Oftentimes it comes when you're young and is damaging. There's not a week that goes by where I am not talking with a man. This happens to women as well, but I'll be talking to a man who's in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, sometimes 70s, who is still dealing with a wound because of something their father said or did not say. Something harmful their father said to them, or something their dad needed to say but was unable to say. I find men constantly walking through their father wound, and it usually has to do with words, right? Words have the power to hurt, to destroy, to set people back. I want you to think about like your own words. I was reflecting on this, and it broke my heart to think of the times in my life where in anger I said things that you just can't take back. Said things to people you disagreed with, to my spouse. I was thinking about, I'm on my fourth teenager right now, and there are times when I've said things to my teenagers, and as soon as it leaves your mouth, you're like, oh, they're gonna need to go to counseling about that. It doesn't matter how much I apologize, why did I say that? Right? So most of us feel like we don't have enough to say, or we say all the wrong things. The big emphasis that Paul is making in this passage is this: the God of the universe can use your voice. He can use your tongues, your words, to bring life to bring restoration, to bring this intimate worship between God and a human being. And so I think the big portion of this text, if I would just challenge you to do one thing, is like, could you just surrender your voice to God? Next week, we'll talk about what does that mean to be a prophetic person. But even in this, instead of me controlling, like, can I just, God, you just have permission. You have permission to speak through me. You have permission to speak through me in ways I understand, in ways I don't understand. I'm going to value, I'm going to be careful of the things I say. But would the God of the universe work through us to be our hands, our feet, and what? His mouthpiece. His mouthpiece. Would you pray with me?